21 aircraft types, 4 years of war. One question: how did Japan go from air superiority at Pearl Harbor to throwing pilots at ships in modified trainers? The answer isn't just the Zero, it's the Oscar, the Frank, the Betty, the Kate, the Val, the Tony, the Jack, the George, and a dozen others you've never heard of. Some were brilliant, some were death traps. A few were genuinely advanced but arrived when Japan's factories were rubble and there was no fuel left to fly them. This is the complete story. Every major Japanese aircraft of World War II. No fluff, pure history. Here we go. Let's start with the aircraft that shocked the world. Navy fighters. The Mitsubishi A6M0. For the first 6 months of the Pacific War, this name struck fear into Allied pilots. Imagine a fighter that could outmaneuver anything in the sky, stay airborne for 8 hours, and strike 1,900 miles from its carrier. At Pearl Harbor, Zeros swept aside the few American fighters that got airborne. At the Philippines, they annihilated the Far East Air Force. Over Singapore, they dominated the RAF. But here's the tragedy. The Zero's greatest strength was also its fatal weakness. To achieve that incredible range and maneuverability, designers stripped away everything unnecessary. Armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, even radio equipment in early models. One good burst from an American .50 caliber, and the Zero became a fireball. By 1943, when the Americans learned to avoid dogfighting and instead use boom and zoom tactics, the Zero went from hunter to prey. Japan kept producing them until the end, but they were flying coffins by 1944. Then came the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, Jack to the Allies. Picture this. B-29 superfortresses are pounding Japanese cities from 30,000 feet. Standard fighters can't reach them. So Japan designed the Jack, a stubby, heavily armed interceptor with 4 20mm cannons. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, the Kasei engine overheated constantly. The streamlined canopy gave pilots terrible visibility, and by the time they fixed these problems, American P-51 Mustangs were escorting those B-29s, and no Japanese fighter could touch them. The strangest offspring of the Zero family, the A6M2N Rufe. Take a Zero, strap massive pontoons underneath it, and station it at remote Pacific islands with no airstrips. Sounds clever, right? Except those floats destroyed everything that made the Zero dangerous. It became 30 pounds slower, wallowed in turns, and couldn't climb worth a damn. Only 327 were built, and most were destroyed on the water by strafing Allied fighters before they could even take off. Now let's move on to Army fighters. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, Oscar to Allied intelligence. This was the Zero's Army cousin, and it became the most produced Japanese Army fighter of the war, with over 5,900 built. Pilots absolutely loved it. Incredibly light, absurdly maneuverable, easy to fly. In the hands of an ace, the Oscar was lethal. But here's the problem. It was armed like a training aircraft. Just 2 12.7mm machine guns. No armor, no self-sealing tanks. Early models literally had fabric-covered control surfaces. When a P-38 Lightning pilot caught an Oscar, it was target practice. Yet Japanese pilots kept flying them, kept scoring kills, kept dying in them, because there was nothing else. The Oscar epitomized Japan's aviation dilemma: brilliant design philosophy, catastrophic strategic thinking. The Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki, Allied codename Tojo, after Japan's prime minister. The Army wanted a high-speed interceptor. Nakajima delivered. It was fast, climbed like a rocket, and some versions carried 40mm cannons that could destroy a bomber with a single hit. Japanese pilots hated it. Why? Because it didn't turn well, and Japanese fighter doctrine was built entirely around dogfighting and maneuverability. High-speed slashing attacks, energy fighting. That was American thinking. So even though the Tojo was objectively a better aircraft for 1943-44 combat, pilots rejected it. Those who learned to fly it properly became bomber killers. Most just wanted their Oscars back. The Kawasaki Kai-61 Hien, Tony. This is fascinating. Walk around a Tony and you'd swear it was German. That's because it basically was. The engine was a license-built Daimler-Benz DB601, the same power plant as the Bf-109. This gave the Tony something no other Japanese fighter had, a liquid-cooled inline engine. This meant better high-altitude performance, a sleeker nose profile, and improved dive speed. American pilots who encountered Tonys reported they were actually dangerous opponents, unlike the increasingly obsolete Oscars. But that German engine, absolute maintenance nightmare. Oil leaks, overheating, mysterious failures. Japanese factories couldn't build them to German precision standards. Many Tonys sat grounded, waiting for engine replacements that never came. Now, let's move on to late-war superfighters, the Nakajima Ki-84. Hayate. Frank. Stop everything. This is important. The Frank was, on paper, one of the finest fighters of World War II. Fast, 392 miles per hour. Maneuverable, could turn with the best. Heavily armed, two 20mm cannons, two 12.7mm machine guns. Protected, actual armor plating. Allied test pilots who flew captured Franks were shocked. This thing could dogfight with a Zero, energy fight with a P-51, and destroy bombers like a FW-190. So why didn't it turn the tide? Because by late 1944, Japanese industry was collapsing. Factories were staffed by barely trained workers, often women and children. Quality control was non-existent. Landing gear collapsed, engines seized, hydraulics failed. Of the 3,500 Franks built, how many were actually combat ready at any given time? Maybe a third. And even those couldn't fly. There was no fuel. Japan's best fighters spent the war sitting under trees, waiting for gasoline that never came. Here's a weird one. The Kawanishi N-1K-1 Rex, a floatplane fighter designed to support island invasions where no airstrips existed. It was terrible. Too heavy, too slow, too vulnerable. Only 97 built before they gave up. But then someone had a crazy idea. What if we remove the floats and turn this into a land-based fighter? The result was the N-1K-2J Shidenkai, George. And holy hell, it was good. Automatic combat flaps for incredible maneuverability. 4 20mm cannons. Strong construction. The George could go toe-to-toe with late-war American fighters and win. But only 400 were built before the war ended. Too little, too late. The story of Japanese late-war aviation. Moving to obsolete fighters, the Nakajima Ki-27, NATE. Picture a biplane, but make it a monoplane. That's essentially the NATE, a fixed landing gear, open cockpit fighter that wouldn't have been out of place in 1935. By 1941, it was a museum piece, armed with 2 rifle-caliber machine guns that couldn't even penetrate bomber armor. Yet over 3,300 were built, and they kept flying combat missions into 1944. Why? Because Japan had nothing else. Ace pilots could still score kills in NATEs through pure skill, but that was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. You might get lucky, but you're probably going to die. Finally, let's talk about bombers, torpedo, and dive types. The Nakajima B-5N Kate. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 40 Kates carried modified aerial torpedoes across Oahu and dropped them in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. 5 American battleships sank or capsized. The age of the battleship ended that morning, and the Kate was the executioner. But the Kate was also slow, just 228 miles per hour. Maximum, unarmored, vulnerable. At Midway, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire massacred entire Kate squadrons. By 1943, flying a Kate was essentially a suicide mission. They kept flying them anyway because there was no replacement. The dive bomber that sank an Empire, D-3A Val. The Aichi D-3A Val. Look at those fixed landing gear. Looks old-fashioned, doesn't it? But those fixed gear actually stabilized the Val during its 60-degree dive attacks. And in the first 6 months of the war, Vals sank more Allied ships than any other aircraft type. They sank the carrier HMS Hermes, the cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and dozens of other vessels. But speed, only 267 miles per hour. Armor, none. Once American fighters learned to intercept strike packages before they reached the fleet, Vals started falling from the sky in droves. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, VALs were slaughtered by the hundreds. The speed demon D4Y Suisei Judy, so Japan designed a replacement, the Yokosuka D4Y Judy. At 343 miles per hour, it was faster than some fighters. Based on the German He-118, it had a sleek, modern design. It could actually survive encounters with enemy fighters. The problem? It didn't enter service until 1944, after Japan's carriers had been sunk. Most Judys operated from land bases where their speed advantage was irrelevant. B-29 raids kept destroying the factories. Engine problems plagued the design. The Judy represented what Japanese aviation could have been, but never was. Now for heavy and medium bombers, the Flying Lighter, G4M Betty. Ask any Allied fighter pilot in the Pacific about the Mitsubishi G4M Betty and watch them smile. They called it the Flying Lighter, or one-shot lighter, because it exploded so spectacularly when hit. Why? Because to achieve its incredible 2,900-mile range, Mitsubishi eliminated armor, used unprotected fuel tanks, and made the whole thing out of lightweight materials. One burst, boom. Fireball. The most famous Betty casualty? Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, shot down by American P-38s in 1943 while flying in a Betty. The Betty symbolized Japan's strategic obsession with range over survivability. They could strike anywhere, but they couldn't come home. The obsolete heavy Ki-21. Sally. The Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally was Japan's primary heavy bomber in the early war, particularly over China. But heavy is relative. Its bomb load was mediocre, its speed was only 302 miles per hour, and its defensive armament was pitiful. 5 7.7mm machine guns that couldn't stop a determined fighter. By 1943, Sallies were easy kills. Production stopped because there was no point building them anymore. The failed light bomber, Ki-48 Lily. The Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily was supposed to be a fast tactical bomber. Instead, it was too slow to escape fighters, 314 miles per hour, carried too few bombs, 1,100 pounds, and had inadequate defensive guns. Most were destroyed on the ground during Allied airfield attacks. It represents the Japan's mid-war crisis. Their aircraft designs couldn't keep pace with Allied improvements. The late arrival, P-1Y Ginga, Francis. The Yokosuka P-1Y Ginga, Francis, was actually good. At 340 miles per hour, it was fast for a bomber. It could carry torpedoes or 2,200 pounds of bombs. Crews loved its handling, but it didn't enter service until October 1944, after Japan's strategic situation had collapsed. Most Francis were either destroyed by fuel shortages or converted into kamikaze aircraft. A capable bomber, wasted. Let's look at reconnaissance and night fighters. The long-range scout, E-13A Jake. The Aichi, E-13A Jake, the float plane that could fly for 15 hours straight. A Jake from submarine Knowing 21 reconnoitered Pearl Harbor days before the attack, providing updated intelligence. Jake spotted the American carriers at Midway. They were the eyes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Night Hunter, J-1N1 Gekko Irving. The Nakajima J-1N1 Gekko Irving started as a failed escort fighter but found redemption as a night fighter. Modified with upward-firing 20mm cannons, Irvings would creep beneath B-29s at night and fire upward into their bellies. Several aces scored double-digit kills this way. The problem? Japan lacked effective airborne radar and proper night fighter training. Only a handful of elite units operated Irvings effectively. Most sat idle because there was no one trained to fly them. The anti-bomber specialist, Ki-45 Toryu Nick. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Nick was designed as an escort fighter but became a bomber-destroyer. Some variants carried a 37mm cannon in the nose that could blow apart a B-24 with a single hit. But at 340 miles per hour, the Nick couldn't dogfight Allied escorts. In the desperate final months, Nick pilots began ramming B-29s, a one-way ticket called Tayatari. That wasn't tactical brilliance, that was national suicide.